This is WRUULP, Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. You are listening to One Human Nation with your host, Sandy Batiste. This program will be talking about race and race relations in your community and nationally.
Welcome to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste, trying to get it together here. I think the change of weather has thrown me off just a little bit, but welcome to another show, and we're actually at show 43. So before we get started, I am going to do some little adjustments here, and I am going to let you listen to a little bit more of the intro music for the One Human Nation show. So welcome to the One Human Nation show. I'm your host, Sandy Batiste. I think I've got everything together for us to get started with today's show. And remember, the viewpoints expressed in the following program are not necessarily those of WRUU, its license holder, or its staff. And today's show is going to focus on education. I've had the opportunity to kind of get more engaged in the education side of what's happening in our community and just kind of observing what's going on with our local Savannah Chatham County School Board and just some other things related to our education, talking to different people, some who are involved with charter schools and private schools, some that have been in the public school and moved over into different sectors. And it's interesting because some of the same dynamics exist. It kind of, the cycle or the pattern doesn't change because we have this systemic problem of dealing with race and racism in our culture. And it's just a byproduct of us being born and raised in the United States of America. As difficult as it is for us to accept that and reconcile with that, it doesn't mean you have to adjust and just lay down and give up hope. It means that you have to be aware and awake. So on today's show, as we look at education, we're going to be looking at some systemic problems. We're going to be listening to some of the talks from Dr. Joy DeGruy as she specifically addresses Understanding the Human Condition. It was published in 2017 as part of the Transatlantic Productions. She's been being interviewed by male, so sometimes if you hear a male voice, that's what that is going on. Sandy hasn't changed her voice or anything. That's just part of the clip. And so as we unpack some of the things that we're going to be hearing from Dr. Joy, I'm also going to introduce some of the local issues going on with the school board elections, the dynamics of what's happening with the accreditation, and some of the things that I've observed just by watching the school board meetings and the role of implicit bias, as well as some of the things that have popped up with teachers kind of having their point of view, propaganda kind of taught in the classrooms, not kind of, but blatantly taught in the classrooms, and a specific one that's come up recently with a 25-year-old female out of a middle school in Florida. So we're going to get started with Dr. Joy kind of getting into what the purpose of education was and what was the intent for shaping a person's worldview and creating a mature mind. So without further ado, let's take a listen to Dr. Joy DeGruy.
First of all, looking at the purpose of education, I think the purpose of education in any society is to facilitate the development of a mature mind. I think that that's the goal, that that's the focus, to bring a person into an awareness of their full humanness. As it relates to the structuring of classes and controlling the minds of the people, the education that we receive is reflective of the dominant societies or the dominant culture's worldview. As it relates to African American people, I think ultimately, when you look at the history of how we have been folded into the curriculum, as we've been folded into, if you will, American history, it's certainly not a positive picture. That not being a positive picture, we have to take a look at that. And then we can understand what the motivations are, or why, or how African American children, in particular, youth, adults in the educational system, have been controlled. Well, fundamentally, Europeans had to somehow make okay their oppression. They had to make okay their aggression. They had to make okay their theft, their rape. And the way that they did that was to fold it into a level of normalcy in an educational arena, which suggested that these people, meaning African American people, were deserving of such treatment. That somehow African American people, or people of African descent, Africans, were lacking what Europeans had as it related to intelligence, morality, physical capacity, spirituality, even having a soul. All these things were questioned by people, that various individuals within the educational system. When I think about, John Newton, who penned the Amazing Grace, and as we look at his behavior, again, this is an individual that said that black people were without souls and thus not destined for the next life, which then, in his mind, I imagine, justified his raping girls and women on slave ships. You see, so you look at that behavior, and then you look at statements by Carl von Linnaeus, a preeminent biologist, best known, said to be the father of anthropology, who is best known for the classification of species and genus and phylum, all of the things that we know as it relates to biological classification. He then put in the 1700s, into the pot, his notion of race classification. And of course, fundamentally, this becomes part of our education, because Carl von Linnaeus becomes someone that's unavoidable if you study high school biology, for example. And what he suggests is that we are by nature, by a fact of science, inferior. That we are lustful, cunning, lazy, governed by caprice. These are the things he said were inherent, scientifically proven qualities of people of African descent. So one has to ask, why would he say such a thing? Well, you're talking about 1777, we're talking about a period of time when American chattel slavery was existing in the country. And again, we have to ease the mind and the conscience, not only of white Americans, but of those looking on at America, so that they too can feel comfortable with this peculiar institution called slavery. So then it moves along a continuum, and so those individuals in various branches of science, of literature, begin to throw their parts into it to ease the public conscience, society's conscience. Now, I haven't spoken about what that does to the African. I'm talking about what that education has done to rest the mind and conscience of white people, to allow them to go to church on Sunday and not feel any guilt, to allow them to barter, to sell away little children and to rape little girls, and for that to somehow be okay when I sing hymns on Sunday. Those are the things that I'm talking about, that you begin to, that's the structural racism that exists to maintain the population who is doing the oppressing. These people are the ones we want to continue to feel good about it, because we profit by it. Because, by and large, African enslavement was about money and power.
So you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and today's show is focused on education. And as I started looking more into this topic of education, because I've really become aware of more of the problems or situations surrounding our youth in the city of Savannah. And to me, one of the major components of that is what has gone on and what is going on with our education system. So you've been listening to Dr. Joy DeGruy, and she's kind of starting from the historical perspective of how things were kind of created as part of the education process. But, I wanted to look to see if there was kind of recent data, because I also am aware of the school to prison pipeline and taking third grade data to really predict how many prisons need to be built. And I wanted to see if there was any more recent data to kind of show that things were maybe getting better and balancing out. And unfortunately, I don't have good news about that, but I think one of the reasons for that is we don't address implicit bias. We don't really take a look at, having people that are involved in our education system. And since we're talking about education, I'm going to say education system. I think it's true of any of our systems that historically we have a system of racism. But since we're focusing on education, I think part of the process is we do a lot to prepare teachers for the classroom, and they do an exceptional job based on, in many instances, what they are paid. But we don't address the issue of our individual bias. What is it within ourselves, whether we're a teacher, whether we are an attorney, a nurse, a doctor, whatever the situation is. And until we start doing that, we're going to still have the problems that we see based on this study. And I think this was one from 2016 from the Yale Child Study Center. And so one of the things that, according to this study, Black students were nearly 4 times as likely to be suspended as white students, and nearly twice as likely to be expelled. And in this same year, there was another report that Black preschoolers are 3.6 times more likely to receive 1 or more out-of-school suspensions. And so what this research did through Yale, there's a professor at Yale, Walter Gilliam, and he showed 135 educators videos of children in a classroom setting. And each video had a Black boy and girl and a white boy and girl. And the teachers, here's what they were told. We are interested in learning about how teachers detect challenging behavior in the classroom. Sometimes this involves seeing behavior before it becomes problematic. The video segments you are about to view are of preschoolers engaging in various activities. Some clips may or may not contain challenging behaviors. Your job is to press the enter key on the external keypad every time you see a behavior that could become a potential challenge. So while the teachers were asked to detect challenge behavior, in reality, no such behavior existed in any of the videos. Yet, when asked which children require the most attention, 42% of the teachers identified the Black boy. The participants' conscious appraisal of whom they believed required the most attention closely mirrored the same independent results of, they have this eye tracking technology that research teams use when they go in to observe teachers. And they noted that preschool teachers show a tendency to more closely observe Black students, and especially boys, when challenging behaviors are expected. So there's more that you can take a look at on this. And it just kind of keeps perpetuating itself as these kids get older and older, and what happens when they're put into, and I hate this phrase, but that at-risk group, because really I do think it comes down to are teachers aware? And I'm not picking on teachers because, again, based on what you have to work with, I think teachers are phenomenal. And I know teachers that go above and beyond to make sure they try to balance things out in their classrooms because they are already awake and aware. But I think that's a small percentage, or a smaller percentage than those that are blatantly, or I should say unconsciously, have a bias. And there should be, at this point in time, a way, there are implicit associated tests that schools can engage in to determine, and not to exclude that person from a teaching position, but making that person aware that, these are the areas that you need to be aware of and work on. And, it's sometimes surprising to me when I do an implicit bias test, because I may be thinking I'm thinking one way, and the test may show something else. Well, I don't use that as a harsh judgment of myself. I use that as a barometer to keep testing and reviewing, how am I really doing on this reconciliation journey? Because if I can't look at what's happening internally with me, I can't be a benefit to other people that I'm engaging with. So we're going to continue to listen to Dr. Joy DeGruy, and she's talking specifically about the education system and what's happened. And this particular portion is going to focus some on the curriculum and material. So we're going to continue listening to Dr. Joy DeGruy.
So now we have to look at these people that now they're here, and they have, been freed. And what happens upon freeing these people that you have consistently demonized, dehumanized, victimized, and oppressed? How do you coexist? And some, like Thomas Jefferson, didn't believe it was possible to coexist. Suggests that they should be moved way beyond, back to Africa, away from the memory, the 10,000 recollections, to quote him, of what has been done to them. That he believed would end up causing the extermination of one or the other race, white or black. He didn't believe they could coexist because we'd remember what was done to us. So what do? You erase the memory. And education in America has done just that. They have placed us in history in a way that allows them to seem favorable. Case in point, the Negro problem. The Negro problem, which was part of the white man's burden, they kind of reframed this whole enslavement issue by saying, we're just trying to civilize you. Mm-hmm. Do you see? So again, we have to understand how that operates systemically. So now what we're saying in an educational arena is that basically this whole idea of enslavement was for your own good. And then we have to now we've already convinced white people of that, so that they can, again, go to church on Sunday. And I say that deliberately, because that's in fact what they did. After lynchings, after rapes, they went to church, So we have to understand, how does one reconcile that inconsistency with considering oneself superior and yet behaving in a barbaric way? So now we've solved the problem of the dissonance associated with the white people, who might think, maybe this isn't right what we're doing to these people. Just to make certain that didn't happen, they justified it by, again, remember, one, we are scientifically proven to be somehow inferior, and two, through the benevolence of white people, we're going to simply help you become more civilized. Mm-hmm. Okay, now we have to convince those who were enslaved and their descendants that this is also okay. So what we do is, not only do we give you the same education we give the white child about how much better off you are now and how horrific a people that you are, people like Aristotle, who said that black people were natural slaves, that by a peculiar act of nature, the color of skin, the skin raises the presumption of slavery, and that we were permanently suited for a laborious class. And this is, of course, Aristotle, and most folks think he was smart. So again, it feeds into that notion. But you got to remember, as white people are hearing it, black people are hearing it also. And yet, trying to retain, as we have, an intrinsic feeling of nobility an intrinsic feeling of worth in the midst of someone dehumanizing you for centuries. So now what happens to the curricular materials? Well, we simply, we take out anything that would cast a negative look at the oppressor. And we then exponentially reflect any of the deficits or any of the challenges that are existing within the African culture or African American culture as well. We heighten all of the information that we can share about any of the deficits or any of the, again, the challenges that have affected the people that you have so long oppressed. In other words, we blame it on them. And we're just trying to help you because you're just, again, inherently defective. And so after you hear that after a while, and then you have curricular materials, and then you have things like media that then feeds into it. So all of these become, they conspire and they are complicit in maintaining this notion that this is what you are. Everything from, and it's so interesting because it shows itself over and over in film. Yes. What do we reward? We reward the images that we have projected. We're not going to reward the image of a noble, aspiring man of African descent, but we will reward a pimp, a hustler, a criminal, and we're not going to reward a noble, beautiful, moral, healthy black woman, hence precious. We're going to again reward you to perpetuate the images that we need you to continue to have of yourself, and then we'll also continue to justify for white people why it always is this way.
So if you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and today's show is focusing on our system of education and kind of how we got here and where we are in trying to really create more empathy in teaching. So I've referenced earlier this Yale study, and there was some additional information I want to share with you from that study that basically, it goes on to state that the researchers noted that when teachers were also given information about the disruptive child's home life and family stressors, teachers only reacted more empathetically if the teacher and student were of the same race. Otherwise, teachers rated the students more severely. The report suspects this is because teachers felt powerless to improve the students' situation. And this researcher, Gilliam, is the lead researcher on this. He says these findings suggest that teachers need support in understanding family struggles as they may relate to child behaviors, especially when the teacher and child are of a different race. And so in some ways, this is good news because part of his study shows that teachers are open and willing to do the work, but we have to raise the issue. Is that being done? And one of the things that he suggests is that to have anti-bias training programs, as well as he made the suggestion of consulting with, there's a Dr. Howard Stevenson of the University of Pennsylvania on racial literacy and racial climate in schools. And I guess my point about all of this is that, this issue of race and racism is not going to go away. It's not disappearing. It's here in our education system. I've talked to someone that's in the independent school district, and they have to deal with the same issue, even though they have some phenomenal programs, some phenomenal teachers. There is this underlying core issue of how to get a different outcome. And there's also part of this this information that I was reading through. There was a Harvard graduate from the School of Education. She was a white teacher. Her name was Lauren Owen. And she wrote an essay on the need for empathy in teaching. She was saying that race is a category, though a socially constructed one, that we can see, and thereby also in some ways easier to identify with. I think it's tough, this is according to Lauren Owing, to get past visual indicators of sameness or differentness because they are reinforced too frequently. And so it's easier to empathize when we have similar experiences with someone who looks the same as us. And I've said before, we have to get away from the dynamics or, the narrative of, okay, they're good and bad people. I think they're just people that are not awake. And the more people become awake, the more they can start making a change, because we can get to that critical mass that's needed to make it a reality. And I won't speak to what Dr. Joy alluded to as far as the media and what's projected there and how that shapes that social construct and continues to reinforce it. So the next part that we're going to listen to from Dr. Joy is really looking back at history and knowing our history, and kind of one of the parts of our history that's missing from the history book. So let's take a listen.
Education has, while we have, Carter G. Woodson made it very clear that we were miseducated. And he didn't have any more words to say than miseducated, because we could put a whole lot more than miseducated on that. We were miseducated, we were dehumanized, we were brainwashed, we were beaten into submission, we were victimized by learned helplessness. All of those things would feed into that miseducation. And so when we look at the residual impact of that, when we look at what does that do to a people, you begin to question your fundamental self. Yes. And when you have detached that person from their culture, again, we had to be very careful to destroy all of the African roots from which we came, the rituals, the customs, the practices that built village and community. Those things were severed, as well as the language. And what we understand now, based on data that has been collected in contemporary society, that severing people from their culture is tantamount to the death of the self. It's completely. The death of the culture is tantamount to the death of the self.
Could you say that again, please?
That when you destroy the links that a people have, any people, with their culture, you destroy them. Because it is by far more important, the ideas of community and family and custom that make up what we call culture is far more important than any physical disaster that can happen to a people. Because you've removed them from the essence of who they are. And in the words of Randall Robinson, that the worst thing that you can do to a people is to rob them of the memory of themselves. And so if you don't know who you are, you most certainly can't figure out where you're going, which is what we're seeing. And in addition to that, what we have folded into that are the contemporary issues, the mess that everyone's in, the materialism, the drug abuse, the over-sexualizing of, everything, right? So you begin to look at that and you fold it on top of what I call post-traumatic slave syndrome. All of the qualities that I'm saying are the residual impact of that, those centuries of oppression unaddressed, and the perpetual miseducation and demonizing of all that is black. And when you look at that, you're looking at the actual destruction of a people. That's what it results in. If, of course, you don't do anything about it. If you don't stop and go, whoa, someone's trying to sell me some strange Kool-Aid here, and I'm not buying it. When you take it upon yourself to educate yourself, when you take it upon yourself to not allow the media to teach you who you are, when you take it upon yourself to control what is going into the hearts, minds, and bodies of your own children, and that you don't leave that to a system that has spent most of its time trying to avoid the truth. Hence the need for Black history, the need for historically Black institutions, Because the only way to balance that is to maintain, is to remember Sankofa. The only way to retain that sense of self, to rebuild that sense of self, is to have an understanding of who you are. And you cannot know that without understanding your own real history, which is the reason why we have to have it. Because if we don't do it, there is a disincentive for contemporary educational institutions because, well, who looks bad? Who's going to look badly in this?
If you just tuned in, you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and it's time for us to take a little break so we can make some of our announcements. So stay tuned, and we'll continue on this topic of education and some of the stories that are happening locally, as well as with some of the other areas that I want to touch base on. I'm sure you've heard of the teacher that had a separate life going on, or a different life going on, but using the classroom for her ideas of what was the better race. So stay tuned, and we'll continue with the One Human Nation show after a couple of announcements.
This portion of WRUU LP Savannah Soundings programming is made possible by a grant from Brighter Day Natural Foods, offering produce, vitamins, and supplements, and a deli and juice bar. Brighter Day is located at 1102 Bull Street at the south end of Forsyth Park. More information available at 912-236-4703 or brighterdayfoods.com.
WRUU listeners like you crave exploration and discovery. That's how we can offer your business or organization a unique way to separate your name from the clutter inherent in commercial radio advertising. Underwriting on non-commercial WRUU will make your name stand out because we allow only a limited number of sponsorships per hour, and your message will be reaching listeners who are actively engaged in programs that demand their attention. Let our team build a customized plan to meet your marketing goals by linking your name to our unique music and talk programs. For more information, email underwriting@wruu.org.
Earth Day in Savannah will be celebrated on Saturday, April 21st from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. in Forsyth Park. The free event will feature exhibits and workshops and live performances by the Indigos, Missionary Blues, Zulu Prophet, and Waits & Company. For more information, visit earthdaysavannah.org or call 912-662-5162.
WRUU-LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings, community radio with global soul. Well, welcome back, and we're going to continue to take a look at the subject of education and the importance of really introducing some implicit bias training and racial equity training into our schools. And, it doesn't matter to me whether it's a public school or independent school or charter school. The topic, the problem continues to manifest itself. It doesn't go away. And, I have this unique, in some ways kind of lucky to, I guess, be at this place in my journey that I can look at it objectively and go, well, why should we expect that this has resolved itself when we really haven't dealt with it at the level that we need to deal with it? So we're going to continue listening to Dr. Joy, and she's going to be talking about how can we level the playing field.
And like I tell people all the time, they're not going to let little Cindy and Miss Ann feel uncomfortable about the lies that have been told them all this time about their history. Because you have to understand, little white children have received the same miseducation, misdirection, lies that we have. And so they perpetuate it with their children as well. So unless someone steps out of this cycle of insanity and says, okay, wait a minute now, this is not correct. And then we begin to not only state the truth, but to produce curricular materials and insist that they be infused into the curriculum. And as to whether or not we can ever have a level playing field, I think that when that notion of send us your poor, you're tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, if the whole notion of liberty for all people, and the pursuit of happiness was true for all people, then maybe so. If we stood firm on the principles that America lied about, if we actually lived them, if institutions were in fact just and equitable, but those are the ifs. If all of those, then certainly you can have a level playing field. But like I said, how we get to that, if we can get to that, that's going to be the choice of a collective will of people that are going to not by folks blowing up stuff, not by force or disaster, but by an act of human will. If we can do this by an act of human will, well, most certainly we can level the playing field. But who's going to convince, who's going to put the bell on a cat? Who's going to convince this giant that they should share? Who's going to confront the lies so much so that people have to see the truth of their own history, their own barbarism? And how are they going to in any way appreciate the inclusion of the African contribution? We'll let you talk about your fruit and your festivals. We'll let you talk about a little bit about your art and your dance and your clothes. And we will present that as your history, as your contribution, as if African people did not contribute, the kind of knowledge that stabilizes civilizations. Because that's the African contribution. But they would better like you to believe, well, you have interesting food. And isn't that nice music? But we don't want you to believe that your scientists, your doctors, your architects, your engineers, you name it, on every single level, to the inventions that make and allow life to be so warm and fuzzy in America, as if Africans had no part in that. And that's the travesty, you see. But that it would mean to open that door, to open the door to the contributions, and not only of Africans, but of other people of color that have been summarily erased from curricular materials. So to continually, by omission, train and educate every child in America to believe that everything that is of worth and of value has come from Europeans.
You're listening to the One Human Nation show as we continue unpacking this topic of education and how we have to really have this will to address the problem. To me, that's what reconciliation is all about. It's about taking that step to look at the truth, and enough people have to be engaged and awake. And I think I'm a little bit more hopeful than Dr. Joy DeGruy, or at least the way she may sound in this clip. I've listened to some of her other talks, and I think she is very hopeful, and she'll mention that at the end of this particular talk, because I see more and more people waking up. I see more and more conversations about race and racism, and there is, that sense of, well, what can we do? And the part of it that I think is difficult is it requires looking at ourselves first. And that's whether you're black or white. It doesn't matter which side of the fence you're on. We have to wake up to the reality of this is a byproduct of what we live in, the air we breathe, by being born and raised in the United States of America. And we have to start changing it. And, the curriculum, I'm not a teacher. I haven't looked at the curriculum. I've heard different things about the curriculum and how the story is slanted. And, that's where it has to start. That's one component that definitely has to change. So we're going to take a listen. We're going to continue to listen to, what does this do and how does this play out in the schools when they continue just to hear this one-sided part of our history? What does that do to the psyche of the person that's engaged in the education system?
Let me ask you, what does that do to white people to be fed a continuous diet of distortion and lies, because it is. Mm-hmm. What does that do to their, not so much their personality, but their psyche?
Oh, I'll tell you exactly what it does. It produces the pathology associated with unearned privilege. Unearned privilege. In other words, you have this pathology in white people that they are inherently superior. So it produces this very sick and warped, distorted perspective of their relationship to everything else in the universe. And like people believe that, the sun revolved around the earth, white people think that everything revolves around them. It's the same thing, and it's as ignorant as Earth being flat. So what it produces in white people is a pathology of unearned privilege to such a degree that they are confused when they are not entitled from their vantage point to run it, to control it, to benefit. You see, they believe you have right now, matter of fact, if you look at the neo-Nazi movement, and the rise of the skinhead generation, that whole crew, which is, by the way, growing exponentially as well, but we're not hearing about that, but you will hear about the Crips and the Bloods and oh my God, those Mexican gangs. Nobody's talking about the Klan, which is tripled, and keep a close look at the Tea Party. So what I'm saying here is that you have young people that now, because of the economic situation that, by the way, Europeans placed America in, that are now going, well, wait a minute, every generation has always been able to benefit more, to somehow have more, to somehow, get more as it relates to being white. So now you have white males that are saying, well, my God, I can't even afford to buy a home in the same neighborhood of my parents. Whose fault is that? Oh, it must be, well, it's those immigrants. Just look at them, do the math, and look at what's going on in this country. It must be those immigrants. Because you see, I, as a white male, having earned nothing, am deserving of more than them. That's the pathology. Even though they've actually produced nothing, they believe that they have this unearned privilege, that I should have the best job. I should be able to just, regardless of my credit, go in and get a house in any part of the country that I wish. I should have the preferential treatment. That is unearned privilege that they're expecting to have. And when they're unable to get that unearned privilege, they explode and implode. Hence, the gentleman that flew his plane into the IRS. You mess with my objects, the things that I believe that I'm supposed to have, I implode and explode. And unfortunately, as it relates to people of color, and particularly people of African descent in this country, they become then, the scapegoat for it. It's them. Oh, yeah, and it's those Mexicans coming across the border that suddenly are becoming a problem because I can't get my unearned privileges. I can't get those needs met, which means that I should have bigger, better, newer, more. Unearned privilege, and it metastasizes into a pathology that again results in sometimes outward violence or inward violence.
Let me ask you.
So you're listening to the One Human Nation show, and I'm looking at the time. So I do want to get to. I'm sure you heard about this social studies teacher at a middle school in Florida. It's Crystal River Middle School. She's 25 years old, and I'm looking at a Huffington Post report. and she had a podcast about which was unapologetic, and so this is where she would spread her racist views, and she brought that also into the classroom. Now, she did have a pseudonym, but some of the things that she published on her podcast was calling for the genocide against Muslims, who she believed should be eradicated from the face of the earth. That's a quote, unless they can somehow alter the Quran so it no longer calls for the killing of infidels. She wrote that Islam does not belong in the United States, and says the world's second largest religion poses an existential threat to Western civilization. So it goes on from there. Some of the other things that she would blog about included praising Kevin MacDonald, who's an anti-Semitic author, as well as white supremacists, including David Duke. And really what she was really focused on, and I believe she believed it. I mean, I don't think she would be saying it if she didn't believe it. She basically believed that science has proven that certain races are more intelligent than others. So you can guess which race she thinks is more intelligent than others. And she repeatedly denied that there is any existence of institutional racism and white privilege. And so here is where it gets even more dangerous. What she was able to do is that she would actually bring her thoughts about this into indoctrinating her students with a white nationalist ideology. And she almost got caught because, of course, there were complaints, because I'm sure that some of the students were going home and telling their parents, well, this is what this teacher is saying. And when she was confronted by the principal, she basically lied. So we have a white female, 25. So that piqued my curiosity, because I wondered then, okay, this principal that didn't do any more due diligence after getting the complaint, my little voice was just saying, was this principal also white? And so I went to the website, and as it turns out, the principal was also a white female. And it gets back into that implicit bias, where we're more comfortable with people that look like us, and people that it's more believable because this person probably is a nice person from outward appearances, but that doesn't take away from what was being taught to her students in the classes. And here's one of the things she did that I thought, you have to laugh at some of it, but this was in reference to the 2016 presidential election. And I guess as she was talking to her students, she was asked the question directly by her students, who did she vote for? And so she didn't answer directly, but what she told them that she would reward them if they did answer correctly. So I guess they got extra credit points or something for making the best guess based on logic and just listening to her rhetoric. They kind of assumed that that's the way she would vote. The outcome of this is, of course, it's still being the school district there is still taking a look at what has happened, and the exact quote from the director of the educational services for the school district is, "We'll be looking into the statement she made, checking the validity to see if they violate our code of ethics and policy." Now, I sincerely hope they do violate your code of ethics or policy, but that's a story for another day. So let's continue listening to Dr. Joy DeGruy as we start wrapping up for today's show. And she's going to be talking about, what does it take to rework an education system based on what the education system was originally designed to do.
Well, we have to keep a perpetual underclass. And so, even if you were to look at, it's very interesting, the correspondence of Jefferson and Adams. You start looking at who they call the founding fathers. And you look at their edict. They said, a man should be able to, and they agree. They said, just let them believe they're free. This is white people. They said, just let them believe they're free. Let them stand on a corner and scream to the top of their lungs that they have their rights to free speech, and let them speak. But we don't have to hear them. So it's an interesting reality as it relates to the economy, because America's always had to have an underclass. The new permanent underclass swiftly becoming the Latino Hispanic population, who is now competing for the bottom. And it's amazing with African American people, because when you start looking at Carnegie, the folks who actually developed our original structure of education, they weren't trying to build corporate folks and people who were going to advance to be scholars. They wanted blue collar workers to work in their factories. That's what the goal of American education was. This is not hidden. All you have to do is read what they've said about it. They said they're not trying to produce people who are going to go out and be their competitors. They wanted to raise the level of education just so much so that they could work for them, for the things they ran. Ford industry. And you start looking at all these folks. It wasn't about trying to produce a mature mind that would then become their competitors. No. And so it doesn't surprise me, because and the truth is, it hasn't changed. You see, in that system, that construct, it's flawed. Everyone knows it's flawed. And yet there's been no attempt. Why? To just overhaul the whole thing. I tell people, I said, listen, just don't do whatever they're doing in school and you'll do better. Honestly, just come up with something different and you'll do better. Because we already know what it's producing. And it's certainly not producing mature minds.
So you've been listening to the One Human Nation show, and I apologize. I'm going to have to cut that little clip a little bit short because I'm looking at the time, and so we're almost at the top of the hour. But I hope it has motivated you to be curious and take a closer look at this at our institutions of education. And it doesn't matter whether it's charter schools or independent schools or our public school system, although it's the public school system that I'm most familiar with because that's the system that I grew up in. And so one of the things I do quickly want to point out to you in reference to some of the workings that's going on with our public school system, Savannah Chatham County Schools, and their accreditation. I'm still not going to be able to get as much into this today because we're pretty much out of time. But when you look at the school board meeting, I encourage you to look at it through the lens of reconciliation. And what I notice is it really has a lot to say for the importance of instructing the board into implicit bias, really doing some racial disparity training and having a deeper look at, what's going on with them internally, that they're not functioning together as a board. And I would specifically look at implicit bias as it relates to age, as it relates to female to gender, and even female to female, and as it relates to race, black and white. So I'll just leave that there for now and let you think about that, and hopefully you get an opportunity to watch the school board meetings and see if you pick up on what I'm referring to. So again, if this is the first time tuning into the One Human Nation show, thank you for tuning in. There's also a podcast that you can subscribe to, and it's on iTunes under One Human Nation, or you can go to the website for onehumannation.info and subscribe there also. We also have a Facebook page, And as we continue on with the One Human Nation show, I hope that it's getting to be where more and more people are recognizing that it's really up to us. It's up to us to be aware and awake to start really building the critical mass needed to make a change. So next up is going to be Sound Limit. And Troy's not going to be with you today. It's going to be John Bennett. And I'm not going to even try to think about what he's going to be bringing because it's always a surprise. But I am going to be, I'm going to be turning it over. And thanks for listening. And I hope you have a week that's the end of a week that's safe as well as productive. And tune in next week.